perhaps like a little ambitious. Not that I'm revising my game plan or anything, but just to sort of like give two broad sort of goals that I want to accomplish. The first is just like get across the fact that immigration law is complicated, but it's not that complicated. And that if you look throughout history, it's pretty easy to see very huge changes, heavy-handed, obvious ones that had clear effects that were probably extremely, foreseeable. And so, the beginning of wisdom is not doing that kind of shit, I think. And then on the other hand, there are other changes that get made that, where obviously the status quo was just better, and you can see why. And if you take like why the status quo was better and you sort of amplify that up a little bit, then you get something beginning to approach, a system that reflects some measure of humanity and justice, right? And then the other thing I would say is that really what's old is new again in a lot of like different really weird ways, a lot of like really specific ways.
Right.
Like
I think can I interrupt you? Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No, go ahead.
I had this I was thinking about the 14th Amendment, as you do
As
when
you
you're
do.
just driving around, and how we had to, there was a time in this country when we had to decide like what to do with all these formerly not people. And so we amended the Constitution and said they get to stay and they get to be U.S. citizens. But that wasn't necessarily, guaranteed to have happened. But that's what we decided. But with other shades of brown, and even with former slaves and people of color, we've made it very clear throughout the entire history of our country that we really don't want them here. And I think this is especially true for immigrants, and that you can see that through all the things we're going to talk today up until, these recent programs like the Remain in Mexico. Like you can apply for asylum, but just like don't be here.
Yeah.
Right? So the general theme, if I could put forward two sort of like uniting strands throughout all of American history, it seems to be that on the one hand, like we just don't want them here, and on the other hand, they do a lot of stuff for cheap, and so we kind of do, but not really. And it's that tension that to this day we haven't resolved in any meaningful way. So,
and related to that, I'd say is also this country founded amidst the values of white supremacy, sometimes explicitly with the values of white supremacy written into law, right? But going forward a bit, as kind of the language at least of science and industrialization takes off, you get the rise of eugenics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and eugenics is on a huge upswing now, even if there are lots of people out there who don't consider themselves eugenicists who are nonetheless advancing bullshit biological determinism about melanin content in skin or whatever the fuck. Stefan Molyneux, Richard Spencer, these people exist, and people who platform them exist, and they have, if not huge audiences, not insignificant ones, right? And this idea that there's such a thing as a fit person, right, for your country is really about to take a huge upswing after the Civil War. And so with all that being said, if you like, Stephen, we'll jump in our time machine. I don't have a TARDIS or anything like that. I don't know if you're into Doctor Who or and I think time travel is actually kind of lame as a vehicle for fiction. It's there's too many paradoxes, contradictions. It's just it seems so lazy, right? Like, but
Yeah,
nonetheless,
were you a Game of Thrones guy?
yeah, yeah, big,
Were you at least a little bit
extremely,
extremely disappointed?
extremely.
So
In the show, yes, extremely.
yeah, Bran, it wasn't entirely clear. It seemed like they were going to do something kind of cool with his time traveling, and then
I was like 80%. This will probably be mostly lame, but 20% like I'll give you a shot. Like let's see.
Let's see what you can do.
Season 6 or whatever, or in season 7 when it's not clear. Like he knows everything that has happened and most of what will happen. And so what does that mean?
They just backed right up. They just backed right off of that. Yeah. They're like, no. But yeah, I agree. It raises too many questions.
So
too many questions.
For the rest of the show will be referred to as Blood Raven, and your Bran Stark. Let's go to 1908. What's warped there, the past. to the State Fair of Shreveport, Louisiana. And I don't know if this is like the first sort of pageant of this kind that ever really happens, but it's got to be like one of the first like modern ones. So in Louisiana and across the good old USA, of course, like I said, there's a hot new craze sweeping the land. It's eugenics. People love that shit. A lot of serious people very into it. And the contest in question involved 78 babies pitted against each other with these eugenics-inspired, standardized scorecards that were total bullshit. Like, let me just make that clear. I mean, there's a few things on there that are basically like what a doctor would check for like physical examination, like, how many teeth are they growing in properly, like all that stuff. But in addition to this, they got things like intelligence and like physical measurements, i.e. like ratios. And they give you like a maximum point value, and then they deduct points based on how far from the sort of standardized ideal the baby strayed. Important categories included, and they're like a bunch of questions phrased exactly like this, dear listener. Quote, lateral diameter of chest taken with calipers at level of nipple line and mid-auxiliary line, end quote.
I mean, I usually check those things a lot, especially on babies, like
daily.
Do we know who won? Do we have?
I have no idea who won. I didn't look. I probably could have found out, but I wasn't that interested. This is the first one, by the way, of this kind. It's been held in like 1908 in Shreveport, Louisiana, at the State Fair. In any case, like the idea that we could, through these concepts of biology and eugenics, get babies and therefore a whole population of people closer to an ideal standardized curve was really, really popular. But
because this was more than like a beauty contest, right? This was like actually trying to prove something, some sort of higher purity. Is that the goal here?
Exactly. Now, I'm sure the listener might be wondering, like, what about children who aren't white? And children who weren't white, like, in these contests, generally speaking, no prizes or ribbons would be awarded. And yeah, you could win cash money doing this shit, which is insane. But the NAACP did have a few of their own of these kinds of contests, and they used the proceeds for, like, anti-lynching campaigns or whatever. This is like a really mainstream thing. It's kind of hard for anything to really catch fire in the United States in 1908 like things can now, because like they don't have television, they don't have the internet, it's just a different communications environment. So for anything, I just feel like for things to catch on even a little bit means there's got to be something there that's really resonating with people.
Right.
And I don't think this caught on just a little bit. It caught on a lot. Like the United States government was into this. The Red Cross was into this. There were spin-off contests. I'll turn it over to you, Stephen. But would you ever put your baby in a Better Baby contest so they can have the fucking diameter of their chest cavity measured. Strange men with calipers.
Well, no, because you can't just trust the calipers of a stranger. I mean, if they had rules about me being able to bring my own calipers, I feel like I trust my own instruments. I do feel like this is a little bit reminiscent of the whole sort of Honey Boo Boo, John Benet Ramsey, whatever this whole scene is.
Honey Boo Boo last night.
Yeah, I don't, as far as I know, they're not taking physical, measurements, but there is this sort of judging based on weird, standardized,
aesthetics, right?
Aesthetics, exactly. And so, some of these things have survived in ways that are considered by some to be benign. I wouldn't do that either, but that's sort of a conversation for a different day.
Yeah,
but
who better to talk about like beauty contests and two
beautiful men,
two beautiful, strong, virile podcasting men. I'm generally opposed to basically all of them of all kinds, like for babies and on up for young women, mostly because I think that they're exploitative, but. I don't know. I'm not gonna say that I've spent a ton of time.
You gotta be careful because at least some percentage of your patrons are going to be of this ilk. So you gotta tread lightly.
I went to prom with the winner of Miss Northside 2003. I did.
Wow! Wow! Look at you.
Yeah, that was bad. What happened to that?
What happened?
I married someone even better.
What's her chest cavity like from? I shouldn't have said that.
No, I love that you did, but I'm just gonna move on.
Okay.
So, like, what does any of this have to do with like the U.S. immigration system? Well, I just want to make the point that like around the same time that eugenics and Better Baby contests and Fitter Family contests, which like you can look that up if you want, are starting to gain steam in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. This is when we start to get some of our first big post-Civil War federal immigration legislation, right? Because I think it's linked between more and more of these white people anxious about their identities and the politics thereof. They have the vote. And it's going to be, somewhat just inevitable that their federal representatives are going to begin trying to respond to their anxieties in order to court their votes. And, one of the first ways that they do that is not with immigrants from Mexico or Europe, really. It's with China. With the, I believe, 1886 Chinese Exclusion Act, which is a pretty big milestone in American history, I'd say.
Right. It's not at all racist.
No, it's got Chinese in the fucking name. Right? So yeah, I love it because it's pretty straight. It's one of those few pieces of legislation where the title really does kind of describe exactly what it is instead of some
it is
bullshit
kind
title.
of it is kind of amazing that they at least used the least offensive version of Chinese, right? Which is the word Chinese, but they could have gone any number of directions. And I really think that we don't give them enough credit for just using the straight descriptor, the actual word.
So this is mostly aimed at immigrant
the Chinese.
Yes, obviously, and they're mostly in California, which had has its own long history of passing its own bills, some of which have held up longer than others in our constitutional system. Eventually, the Supreme Court will say, you can't make immigration policy yourself. That's the federal government's job. And that's part of the reason why the Chinese Exclusion Act existed. But, it will have its own history of sort of trying to either reduce to second-class status or just basic peonage people from China and Asia generally, a lot of different times, I believe they'll like, literally just strip property rights from them on the West Coast, just, by law, and then all of a sudden, every piece of property that any Chinese person would own would immediately fall into the hands of the, hungry white neighbors surrounding them.
Right. It's for people who are super interested in Yakima history. You can go back into the archives.
I'm among them, by the way.
You can go back into the archives of my show where I interviewed a local historian. And this is history that is, I think, completely lost on most people. But, Yakima and other sort of Northwest towns have a really, really super anti-Chinese history where basically laws were passed, again, going back to the sort of overarching theme, that basically made it impossible to be Chinese. They had curfews. You couldn't own or operate Chinese businesses, making it hard for them to own businesses or property, like you're saying. And so there's actually a lot of underground tunnels and rooms and places in these older buildings where the Chinese would, hang out because they weren't allowed to be outside during the day or in the evening, at certain times.
And this has come up on my show before. I forget when. I'm fuzzy on the details, but in Idaho, around the turn of the century from 19th to 20th, like a third of the population of the state was Chinese. And then over like a generation, they're basically all gone.
Right.
Every one of them. Right.
And, we know something of slavery. Most people have heard of it. And it is, and for good reason, it's the most egregious sort of, heinous thing that we've done, or among them, certainly. I'd say number one.
And it's really, kind of the original sin of the nation, people call it.
That's not a hot take. But people don't know a lot about that and a lot about, Jim Crow and these things. The treatment of the Chinese, I think people don't know. What percentage would you guess of Americans have even heard of this, or even know that this was a thing that we went through?
I have no idea. I wouldn't put it very high at all, because even I as I don't think I knew everything about this before I started doing this show, but I probably would have been vaguely aware of it. So if I, who's pretty into this stuff and well read, took a good amount of history classes in college, even if he doesn't have a history degree. Yeah, I'd say that I wouldn't count myself among those who know. So if I don't know, then I gotta assume that at least 50%. Nobody's gonna know about anything about this.
And the number of parallels between, just think about Yakima. When I turn on the radio and I hear the local AM talk radio guys talk about how we got to get rid of the Mexicans because they bring their drugs and they're all drug dealers and they steal our jobs. All of these themes were themes back then, but with the Chinese. So
I don't understand.
All they do
white
is
people love drugs, but they hate people who bring them drugs. It's so weird.
All right, you're right. The Chinese, they're all they do is bring their opium and they smoke their opium and they're taking our jobs and we got to get rid of them. And history is repeating itself, but to a T over and over again. Yeah.
So just to blow out a little bit though, this act, like I said, it's called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So it's designed really to deal with, excuse my framing, but one kind of problem, at least for these people who saw it that way. But it's not going to be really enough to satisfy all these anxious white constituents. So a lot of this should hopefully sound eerily reminiscent of today. The federal government in the early 20s basically declares an emergency. Oh, the border is so bad, there's an emergency now. And so they passed a piece of legislation called the Emergency Quota Act because we need these quotas like real bad right now. And it gives us two enduring qualities for many years to the U.S. immigration system. It gives us at least two anyway. Numerical limits to immigration to the United States for the first time, and the use of a quota system based on national origin. Now, in short term, like, this act was mostly aimed at stopping a lot of Jewish people in Eastern Europe who were desperately trying to flee where they were living because, well, go look it up. It's not a good time to be Jewish in Eastern Europe at this time.
Because of the economy. Because of the economy.
Yeah, the thing is, the economy is so good that people are feeling like life's too easy, so they have to
right. Something like that.
So, but then like a couple years later, we get a more firm piece of legislation called, the Emergency Act, only good for like 3 years, but it restricted immigration to 3% of foreign-born persons of each nationality that reside in the United States based on the 1910 census. So hopefully that's not too complicated to you, listener. So the new act's going to make it like even more reactionary. This is kind of what I mean by like seeing easily how you take a bad system, you just make it shittier. So the first thing it does is it turns the clock back 20 years to 1890 census numbers. So anyone who's come here in that 20 years since, like, they're not counted in this formula anymore, which means a lot of those immigrants who did come over from Eastern Europe, no more of those. And then also they're gonna shave an entire percent off that 3%. So we're down to 2/3 of our original numbers. And immigration, if you look at a chart, I mean, it really does fall off a cliff, man. Like in the intervening time, like, we basically have very, very, very little immigration from these countries. Also, at this time, we got basically no East Asians or South Asians and very few people from Africa because all immigration is now limited to people who are eligible for naturalization. And before I turn this over to you, I want to make this like really basic point for people. We're talking about immigration today. We're also going to talk about like deportation and naturalization, which are sort of related concepts but not the same. So naturalization, just to be basic, is becoming a citizen, right? As opposed to simply like coming here either with papers or without. So before this, you might hear somebody say that the founding of this nation, we had open borders, we had an open immigration policy, and that's true. But who could naturalize was always an incredibly contentious point among people. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, that's an important point because my mom, bless her heart, I've been doing this for a while, but she'll still say something like, oh, there's a lady at church, and I think she's illegal. And my mom is she's a good person, and right now I think her head is on straight politically for the most part, but some of these things escape her.
And then she'll say, language, she's probably been using that for 20 years, right?
Right, and then she'll say, is there any way she can apply for citizenship? Can't she get citizenship? And she even referred to my mother-in-law, who's a permanent resident. She said she was surprised to find out that she's not a citizen. So basically, there's different types of legal status, but in order to become a citizen, you have to pass through this legal permanent resident or green card holder status for a certain amount of time. You need to show that you're, a person of good moral character, that you don't have any disqualifying crimes, that you pay your taxes, blah, 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 blah. And if you meet all these requirements, then maybe we'll let you into the club. But who's been allowed into the club or not has changed a lot over the years. But, these national quotas, nowadays we're talking about what's it called? Merit-based immigration, right?
Right.
So you could also say, well, what we want is a diversity of national origin. And these are all things like that aren't explicitly labeled racist. And you could get away with sounding like you have these other concerns, like, well, we want immigrants to have a certain skill set, and that,
or education level, right?
Education level, yeah. We want to make sure that we're bringing people with certain standards or cultural understandings, that we have a shared sense of cultural oneness. I don't know, whatever. But when you look behind the curtain, you don't have to scratch too deep under the surface to see this is really just about making sure we're bringing white people and the right type of white people, right? So
yeah, it's it's pretty easy to get, say, the president of the United States on tape to just say, why can't we get more people from Sweden and not from these other shithole countries? Paraphrase. One more thing about this law that people might find interesting. Immigration from the Americas, not really included in this. They don't have the same barriers or quota system at this time, which is kind of interesting. But that's about to change big. And I'll be leaving a lot out, but between 1910 and the Great Depression, because there's a lot of like political changes in Mexico itself that also I could get into if I was feeling even more ambitious than I already am, but I'm not. So we'll fast forward a bit and work forward to my favorite president, really great guy, greatest of all time, Herbert Hoover. Just kidding, he sucked ass. He's terrible. He was like,
just kidding.
Yeah, gotcha. So now that we're in the high industrial age before the Great Depression, with increased demands for that labor and agricultural labor, and the politics in Mexico, there's all these are big drivers, and a lot of people across the southwestern United States border coming to the United States from Mexico and for the South. They actually go they're as far afield as Michigan and Indiana. There are communities from Mexico who set up in this country that are still around today. But in 1929, a little thing happens called the Great Depression. And people might be somewhat familiar with it. But what I wasn't familiar with at all at this time was something that happened just called the Great Repatriation between 1929 and 1936. So it starts under Hoover. At first, a lot of these people were simply encouraged to self-deport, who were either Hispanic in heritage or Mexican. But eventually they're going to be forcibly deported between 1929 and 1936. And it's unsure exactly how many, but it's at least 500,000 and probably closer to 2 million people deported forcibly during that time. Around 60% of those were birthright citizens of the United States. So that's more than half of the people that we deported were United States citizens. And we basically dumped them in the middle of Mexico in a lot of cases, penniless, without any access to property or communications with their family, and told them to find a job. It's absolutely insane.
It's definitely insane. I mean, U.S. citizens are still being deported from time to time. These cases are discovered. It sort of shows the degree of scrutiny or justice that we're willing to let pass muster.
I want to say one thing about that, and then I'll let you go. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
Because the scale then is a lot bigger than it is now, but you're right. We do sometimes mistakenly deport United States citizens. And you know why we did that both then and now? One fucking reason. It's because of what they look like, their race, their ethnicity. It's fucking racism. That's it. It's the same thing. It's the same dumbass reason. There is no change 100 years later.
Right. And I've never been to Mexico in 1922, did you say? I've never been in Mexico at that time, but you can kind of, I mean, if you've been to Mexico or Central America today, you could take a guess at what the infrastructure would have been like. If you're deported to Central Mexico today, it's extremely dangerous and the infrastructure is shoddy. But, you could, in theory, like make your way back. You could pick up a telephone and call, a lawyer, maybe, if you could afford it. I'm not at all trying to say that getting deported today would be easy, but like
it would be easier, though, for sure.
Some tools exist that at that time, I mean,
what do you do? You can't.
Yeah. What?
You can't. You write a letter. I mean, Jesus.
Yeah. Even today, a lot of our clients, their address in Mexico is domicilio conocido, which means known address, which means you write to this town or little ranch in Michoacan, Mexico, and you just write their name and you write domicilio conocido, like basically like where this guy lives. It's Juan Ramirez. It's the Ramirez family, and it'll get there if you just mail it. And that's today. So you can imagine back then. I mean, even if you wrote a letter, which I'm assuming was the way you would have tried to remedy this problem. Yeah.
I mean, I guess like the telegraph exists, but like that costs money, and these people are penniless, and like in a place that a lot of places they've never even been to. And even if they are from Mexico, they're probably not from the part of Mexico where we literally just dumped these people. It's really, really.
There's no way to know. I mean, I haven't studied this, specifically, but people for sure died because of this.
Oh yes,
they
did
for
absolutely.
sure. Okay.
No, I checked it up. In a lot of cases, either just from law enforcement killing them during roundups or detention, or dying in transport because they're on ships reminiscent of slave ships, packed in so tightly, or confined in closed boxes and suffocating, or dying due to lack of medical treatment. All of this happened a ton.
Right.
I want to make one other really basic point about this because I think it's important. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as legal advice in any way, even though there is a lawyer here. But some lawyers have argued, and I absolutely 100% agree with them, that the actions of the United States government during this time constitutes the legal definition of state-sponsored ethnic cleansing. And the United States government has, to my knowledge, never even apologized for this. And certainly never paid anyone or reparated anyone for it.
Oh yeah, for sure. And just like the issue with the Chinese, I don't know that anyone knows about this. Like right. Maybe even less.
I had no
people.
idea about this. This is insane. And half of it goes on under Roosevelt. We should add, because the big one's between 1929 and 1936. So. We're at the end of Roosevelt's first term when it finally wraps up.
Yeah, it's and then we're about to go to war, and we're going to change our tune real quick on.
Oh yeah.
on having Mexicans here. It kind of reminds me of Stalin in Poland, and how he, they divide up Poland, and then they deport and kill like everyone who's loyal to Poland, and then they immediately need people loyal to Poland. When Hitler invades. Anyways, it's I've been reading about that recently, so it's on my mind. But I think at this time too, you mentioned this the first time we tried this, that there's no INS or ICE,
right?
And so it's basically up to these like local sheriffs and I don't know, maybe the state patrol, if there's such a thing.
Yeah, it's state and local cops and the State Department and some like affiliated federal auxiliaries are basically just like churning out paperwork. I'd say,
I mean, yeah. How surprised would you be if there was at this time? So many of these were probably carried out without paperwork, and this is not at all to be read as a defense of ICE, but ICE is like an agency that you can FOIA, and they have training Like they're
It's terrible, but yeah.
yeah, no, yeah. They're often very, very bad at their job and definitely ignore their training. And when you have an administration like this one, like they probably don't even do trainings anymore. So again, not at all meant to be a defense of ICE, but what was happening back then was, I think, because of the lack of infrastructure and accountability and all these things, just way worse. I mean, people would have been literally disappearing. Nowadays, if somebody gets picked up, their family can call, me, and we can track down the person right away, and we kind of know where they're at. And all of these tools and mechanisms exist now, which it's still completely horrific and terrifying for the family and totally disgusting as a system. But imagine that same push to do that with none of the protections in place. It's really kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, and before I move on to we move on to the war, Stephen is of course right. Like, we don't do this anymore. Really, we have federal enforcement for this, for better or for ill. However, I just want to remind people that we could, and if things are bad, might go this way again, even just like parallel to federal enforcement, because like, to my mind, this reminds me of Arizona a few years ago when they tried to pass that law, and there was a big fight about having local cops and sheriffs ask people who they have a quote reasonable suspicion are in the country illegally, which is basically just a license for them to ask anyone who looks non-white for some papers, please. Which would be kind of the start of this. Although we're so advanced at this time that, like, honestly, if you even have birth certificate or whatever, or papers or people who can vouch for you about how you're a citizen, Uncle Sam doesn't really give a shit. He says your individual fitness as a person is tied to your race, and you don't meet the cut. So, but like you said, we're gonna change our tune on that, like real quick. Excuse me, hang on a second. I'm sorry. So, starting in August 1942, though, just a few months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, of course, the United States in World War II, we'd change our tune with a really blandly named piece of treaty, I guess is really what it was to start with, called the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement. But most people know this program that results as the Bracero program. If you don't speak Spanish, Bracero is Spanish for manual labor, literally one who works using their arms. So I'll just give you a few basic facts about the Bracero program quick and interrupt me if you got anything. But
yeah, I got a quick story about the word brasso.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So there was a local immigration officer who did naturalization or citizenship interviews. Who he insisted that his Spanish was good enough to do the interviews in Spanish. Uh-oh. And some people qualify to. Normally, you have to learn English to pass the test, unless you've been here long enough with your green card and you're old enough, then you can get an exemption. But anyhow, so he would do these interviews in Spanish, and at the end, you need to swear fealty to the country, and you have to promise that you'd be willing to bear arms on behalf of the United States, and that you'd be willing to do non-combatant work under military direction, I think is the language. I'm getting that wrong, but he would ask like that, people. Yeah, so he would translate arms, which means weapons, right, in this context, as literal physical arms.
Oh, you grab
and so he would say, would you be willing to use your arms, your physical arms, to help the United States? And our clients would be like really confused, but like, yeah, And then the follow-up question is, he would say, would you be willing to do work without your arms.
Oh shit!
Yeah.
I love this.
And people would be like, sure. So
I could kick a ball. I could pedal. Whatever.
yeah.
Jesus.
So out there's at least a couple dozen U.S. citizens who never technically swore to bear arms. They swore to use their physical arms.
I can't wait for that court case, man. Oh, please! I hope you get all the way to the Supreme Court with that.
The interviewing officer asked me if I'd use my physical arms, and yes. So anyhow.
So, during the war, this is there's a labor shortage. Although this program will a lot of people think of it as a wartime program, and it certainly was, but it will legally persist far beyond World War II. But the agreement we basically made with the Mexican government guaranteed, among other things, that the workers from Mexico would not be excluded from white areas based on segregation, gave them a minimum wage, promised basic necessities of life, food, clothing, shelter, all that shit. Some of these workers did okay. Most of them were treated as second-class people, or even worse, maybe. One thing that's a problem always with this type of labor, when it's pseudo-legal or even just totally illegal, is wage theft or pay being slow. Living conditions are often poor, the food sucked, and there's nowhere for these workers to really go to complain. The people in charge of really enforcing this agreement were officials from the Mexican government. And so that meant that actually if you were working in the southwestern United States, it was actually probably a little bit better for you than if you were up near the northwestern where Yakima is, because there were even fewer Mexican government inspectors up there than anywhere else. Strikes during the war and after were absolutely rampant everywhere, especially in the Northwest, and on at least one occasion involved a cool biracial coalition of Japanese American internment camp workers who were also doing farm labor, and braceros who combined forces and all struck at the same time, which is pretty awesome.
Right.
Anyway, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah. So a really good book on this issue is called Defiant Braceros, and it talks about LGBT issues during the Bracero program, organizing in the Bracero program, and it's a really good book. People should read it. But one of the things they talk about is how early on in the program during the war there was a real sense of patriotism that was used and sort of propagated throughout amongst the workers, that you're helping out with this bigger effort.
I forgot to mention this, and I meant to. One of the other perks of this specifically was you were exempt from military service if you participated in this program. So this is equivalent legally to serving in the war via draft,
Right. And, but then, this book also recounts how after the war, the tone really changes, and they're no longer seen as, sort of a critical cog in this war machine. Although they continue to do the same work, right? The same sort of valuable work. And this is also something that I think has been, a lot of people have heard of the program, but erased from history. I've got an uncle who, everybody's got a racist Facebook uncle. Every white person, at least. I don't know. At least one. And he did summer agricultural work as a teenager growing up in Oregon. And, so did I. I picked my boxes of blueberries. But in his mind, the entire agricultural industry in the 1960s was run and operated by fucking teenagers.
Oh man, it's funny you say that, because if you go all the way to 1964, the year this program ends, the next year they literally tried to do that was something called the A team, which stood for like athletes, something like it was basically like baseball players in high school and football players and shit in the summer. We're all gonna like do all the picking.
We're gonna do our part. Yeah.
And they like the program like immediately fell apart because like almost no one signed up, and like almost everyone who did either like quit immediately or immediately went on strike. It was a total failure.
Yeah. It turns out teens are not the best. I mean, teens in general, give me a break. But you're not gonna prop up America's agricultural industry with teens. But and it's funny that idea. I call into my local AM talk radio a lot, and one time, I was trying to get them to just at least acknowledge that like our entire system is built on, our local economy, especially built on the backs of these people who you are demonizing and saying need to leave, and that the economy would collapse if they left. And one of the hosts said that if we deported all the illegals, then people, and this is like straight out of a Disney movie, white people would really heed the call and come together and get the work done, which is what I guess what you're describing.
Yeah.
And it's a total fantasy. But yeah, I mean, this program and this history has also been erased from our memories. But I mean, there were lots of issues with one anecdote from the book is how early on there were real efforts put into teaching English. We hear a lot, well, you're going to come here, you should learn English. And I think there was a sense of that, like, oh, you're going to come here and it'd actually be good for you to be able to communicate with your bosses and things like that. So let's have these English programs. And they learned very quickly that as soon as people could express themselves, they were saying things like, hey, where's my paycheck? and, hey, why are we getting paid so little? And they immediately got rid of those programs. And, again, it's interesting how, these things sort of continue to be echoed throughout history. And nowadays we just say, they're coming here and they're not learning English. Well, some of that is by design. And if we really had a will to teach people English, we have the tools to make that possible.
So I just want to give like two more like things about this Bracero program before I want to talk a little about something that happens concurrently, like while the program's going on when Eisenhower's president. But the first is that there are lots of different ways where we like screwed these people, but one that is pretty amazing is between 1942 and 1948, we required all these workers to have 10% of their pay withheld and put into like a, not Social Security, but a Social Security-like account. It was like a savings account to which like they were going to be legally entitled to get later. All of it was stolen. And we know exactly... It's documented in court cases exactly like where the money went, even. We can find the literal bank and the bank account where the money is/was and who had it. But, the United States government, courts, all of those banks are Mexican, so we can't make them turn it over. So I guess we're done. And we're talking, it's like $500 million. With interest at this point, which is not a small amount of money. Jesus.
Right. And that's a real dwindling population. This book I mentioned, they try and sort of capture an oral history of the program by going down to Mexico and actually interviewing these people. But, most of them are gone now. And I guess two other quick things, the sort of, the program only brought over men and not their families. And so this is,
go ahead.
Yeah. So this is really, in a lot of ways, the first form of a family separation. I mean, it's not as aggressive, I guess, or sort of violent. But again, thinking back to the infrastructure that would have existed at the time, people weren't FaceTiming, obviously, you're writing letters and often not even communicating by telephone. And that's not an easy thing for a society to absorb. And so there were lots of broken families, or, not all the workers sent money back home. And I think, children being raised, even with the fathers who did send money and were, good, hardworking, responsible dads, they weren't around because they were here.
Hard by itself.
Yeah, that's hard by itself. And so there's that. And then also, just this is sort of continues to be the solution for a lot of the business interests, like, because we still have a guest worker program. And my congressman, who's conservative, wants to grow it. That's what he sees as the solution. And, it really does serve certain interests. There were some strikes here a couple years ago at a raspberry farm, and
nice.
the workers, they went on strike, and they had all kinds of bed bugs, and they had sort of a communal bathroom shower area with no soap or toilet paper. And these are, by the way, people picking your raspberries. So
great.
Think about that. Yeah, think about that for a minute. And they were also, dramatically underpaid and all of these things. And the nature of this type of work just makes it hard to organize in the first place, because seasons are short, and then the employers can find other workers, and it makes it even harder when the workers are visiting, and they feel like they're at the mercy of their employer, because they really are. And if the employer knows, these workers are all just fungible, like we can, these ones are making a ruckus, but don't worry, in 3 months
the next
we'll
cycle we'll get another role, right? So as bad as it'll be, like, they'll only be here for a few months at a time. Like, even if you make them legal, and ideally you say the United States government could be really into wage enforcement or whatever, so they are paid what they're legally entitled, and there's no like tiered system where they're paid less than the wage of the citizens around them or whatever. You get all that done, there's still going to be a problem, because they're not going to be able to organize, and capital's going to want to keep it that way. And they love that. That's one of the big reasons they're into this program. The Bracero program, like, far more people come numbers-wise after the war, in the 50s and 60s, than ever came in the 40s. I don't want to make that clear. Like, yes, the work was very important then, but because there's a huge ramp up to this, racist white people, really, there's a huge reaction to this. So while the Bracero program is going on, in 1954, the United States government basically, like, it really does remind me of, like, the way Trump talks about, like, let's just take the gloves off and, like, lick the problem, just a few years of the police, like, running things. It'll be fine. It's kind of what they do, because in 1954, Eisenhower, like, finds a former lieutenant general from the U.S. Army in World War II and basically tells him, like, go take care of this, and we get something called Operation Wetback. Sorry about the name, but
see, that's what I'm saying about the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yeah, could have been worse.
Exactly.
So just basically, if you're not familiar with Operation Wetback, according to their own numbers, at least, the federal government, along with some help from the state and the local governments, either physically put their hands on and deport, or chase back across the border about 1 million undocumented people living in the United States, mostly in the southwestern United States, but not just for living here without papers. Because this Bracero program, like we said, like, it kind of sucks, and even though it does ramp up after the wartime, it's not enough to satisfy capital's demand for cheap, exploitable labor. And these people for their part, like as bad as it is here, need to make money for their families back in Mexico. So, you get what you get. There were like a lot of labor opportunities where we also, again, literally picked these people up and just deposited them in the middle of Mexico without any, way to like recover their property or anything like that, just like we did in the 30s. Was really like the culmination of a decades-long ramp-up in the militarization of the border, which is gonna contribute to this family separation dynamic. Because, like, where, with some exceptions, of course, like definitely in the 30s, when the border gets militarized, and a lot of the time we're talking, people go to and fro north-south across the Mexican-U.S. border all the time, and it's not too tough. But now, like, large parts of it are going to start to be militarized and patrolled, and there's only going to be a limited number of places where you can officially walk in, and it's going to drive a lot of these people to like dangerous environmental conditions. And this is when, like, you start to get a huge ramp up in the people who die in the desert because they don't have water or food, because they're forced to like make a trek across a remote area of Mexico where before it would have been like much easier to cross the border.
Right. And unlike, not to justify the actions of your favorite president, Hoover, again, not to justify the great repatriation, I think, is that what you called it?
Yeah.
But, there was not imagined economic anxiety, but like an actual depression going on, and, labor shortage. Or employment shortage. During the Depression.
Right, I got you. Sorry.
So like it was horrible. They had something to point to. Now, whether or not that was legitimate or not is a whole other question.
It wasn't.
Yeah, right. But at least they had
something.
Some rhetorical thing to point to. But Operation Wetback there was nothing going on, really. I mean, there was no sense that they were, taking jobs, or there was no economic downturn. The economy was doing fine. It was literally just Eisenhower saying, like, we don't want them here. Like, let's clean up this issue and get rid of these people. So again, it's just the idea that, like, we just don't want them here.
Yeah, like then and now, like, as if it's possible to just easily like round up millions of people and deport them and not make a shitload of mistakes about like who gets deported and anything like that. Like, that's a massive undertaking. And it's insane. And to Eisenhower's astonishment, and it doesn't really work. It does nothing long term to stem the tide of undocumented immigrants from the South. And by the way, at this time, like, I've talked a lot about like the Mexico-United States border, but there are, especially now in the 20th century, and then now today, literally the 21st century, i.e. contemporaneous times, there are a lot of people who come through Mexico and not from Mexico. And I believe they're actually the majority. There are actually not that many Mexican nationals who immigrate to the United States these days, in comparison. But in any case, like, fast forwarding 10 years, like, this hodgepodge of federal immigration law is like, it's really fucking messy. It's bullshit, and it makes criminals of tons of people. And Eisenhower, try as he might with military efficiency, he can't just like arrest all the illegals and get rid of the problem. Go figure. So we try kind of like different thing, and alongside like federal immigration law changes, this is like a big one. And some people group it up with like civil rights legislation in terms of like its, impact on making federal law like better, more just. I'm not sure it's like that good, but it's something called the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act, parts of which still are in effect. So we got rid of national origin quotas finally this time, which we have for like 40 years. Our numerical limits on U.S. immigration after this point will exempt immediate relatives. So we first begin to start prioritizing family reunification actually like in law, at least some. We introduced like a new 7-point system for qualifying here as a refugee. There's a whole bunch of other changes. We prioritize in the law educated professionals, so that merit-based immigration. This is going to be entering our lexicon too. So our immigration laws were really bad and racist before this, and in a lot of ways, this 1965 law will make them a lot less bad and racist, which is good. It's going to increase a lot of immigration from Asia in particular, which is obviously good for the diversity of this nation, and I think so anyway. But it also has like one huge like feature that I don't even think they really thought about at all. But for the first time, we cap legal immigration from other American nations at the same time that we end the Bracero program. and that's going to increase over the next few generations hugely the amount of people from south of the United States who are living in the country undocumented.
Right. Yeah, and it seems like that would have been totally predictable.
Yes. Like, I'm not a lawyer, but, like, I feel like I would have seen that coming, but nobody else did. It's the INA, by the way, that a lot of the lawyers pointed to as Trump violating when he tried to ban immigration from 7 majority Muslim nations, because it's the INA prohibits discrimination on the basis of nationality and religion. But the hacks of the Supreme Court, at least most of them, disagree with me on this question, but they're stupid and dumb. So,
yeah, it is interesting if you look at sort of the debate around the implementation of this law at the time. There were lots of arguments about whether or not it would affect U.S. demographics.
Yeah, and Lyndon Johnson swore it wouldn't actually, and who knows what he really thought, but that's what he said.
But it shows that the conversation hasn't really changed. I mean, this is Tucker Carlson, right? Basically, like you could read the writings of racist politicians from 1965, and it seems pretty clear, like, this guy seems racist. But then, Tucker Carlson saying the exact same things, maybe even more explicitly, on one of the most popular news shows. So,
and this law is like really juices up why. I mean, it's part of the reason why, like, even fucking Ronald Reagan, like, nonetheless in the 80s feels he has no choice but to like sign a law that legalizes millions and issues amnesty to hundreds of thousands more, like executive order, because there's like no way out of this problem that they've literally created for themselves in 1965 and then basically didn't bother to fix for like 20 years. I really liked what you had to say last time about how employers begin to treat the documents that workers bring them in order to work for them. Because and I'll just set you up like briefly. So in '86, they do, like, a law does get passed and Reagan signs it that does make it technically illegal to knowingly hire someone who's undocumented, but it also specifically says that the employer has like literally no obligation whatsoever to verify the authenticity of any documents. that they're given.
Right. Yeah. So I will occasionally a client. I don't want to see your fake green card. Like, don't show it to me. I don't want to know that it exists or that you bought it or any like. Just I don't want to know anything about it. But every once in a while, I'll see one, and it's like a half a step above me drawing my face with a Sharpie on a what is it, 3x4 piece of cardboard or something like that. It got stuff taped on it, and it just, the numbers are written in by hand, and you can just imagine them showing up at some orchard. And there's, a foreman there who, okay, I need to see this. All right, fine, whatever. Like, they could not care less. They're not going to call immigration. They're not going to call anybody. And in a lot of places, they'd probably say, oh, well, if you don't have one, I'll just pay you cash at the end of the day anyways. And so, there is an E-Verify system, and businesses do get audited with some frequency. I don't practice that type of law, but I know there are attorneys who help employers who are being audited and that sort of thing. But agriculture is specifically exempt, and if you talk to people in the industry, it's because everyone knows, if you applied E-Verify to agriculture, there would be no agriculture. And so
right, or just like massive food shortages and then like huge price increases.
Exactly. And that's one thing that I don't think people quite understand the scale of, is, thinking back to my friends from the local AM talk radio. They think it's like 10 people from the bad part of town who, they're all drug dealers and they don't have papers. Like that's the illegal problem. And well, I mean, I guess on the one hand, that's sort of how they imagine it. They're aware of the numbers, right? Which sort of contradicts their imagination. But the number of people who are doing, the number of people who are doing really hard work all day long who don't have papers is really staggering. So it's not like, well, if we implemented E-Verify, the agricultural industry would suffer a little bit around the edges. No, it would collapse.
Oh man, this is great because socialists love trains. So,
yeah.
The other thing I want to add about that is, like, yes, it's true. Like, I called Sam with this too, and yeah, I don't really have a problem with pointing it out or anything like that. That, like, yes, the economy that we're operating under is built with the labor of these people in mind. As in, like, being an input, not that it cares that much about them, but like it relies upon it to create value and influences the prices for everything that you eat in a grocery store, basically. But more than that, these people are a part of this nation, even if they're not citizens or legal residents. They live in communities. A lot of cases, they own property. They live in mixed households where some people are legal and some people aren't. They have children. They have hobbies and food and dreams, and they contribute to the sum total of happiness and culture and everything that makes this country like what it is. And the idea that we can just remove them is just monstrous to me on a human level. The economy, yes, but also like just the world that we exist in is built with these people in it. They've made a place for themselves. It's crazy to me to just want to rip them away from that.
It's also interesting how much this comes into relief for somebody who might hold very conservative views the second they find out they know someone who's undocumented. So I've seen people take the most dramatic 180s you could possibly imagine because it's I guess it's a pretty frequent, it's sort of a almost like an immigration lawyer cliche that the white person will come in with their Mexican and say, this guy is one of the
good ones. Exactly.
He's one of the good ones,
Yes.
and I'm here to exercise my white power.
Yeah.
And, let me know what I can do with my money or influence or whatever. And I should be able to fix this problem. And they're often very surprised to find out that they can't. And
Unless
this is
they're literally a senator or something. You can't just be like a local car dealership guy and fucking get this shit done.
Right. And now it's it's also interesting. There's this weird contradiction because I had an industry guy once. He's like the one Democrat in the local sort of agricultural industry. He's kind of a popular guy, but he said that, in order for the jobs to be competitive, they've estimated they would need to pay something like $30 an hour.
So do it.
Yeah, but like he said it in a way as if to suggest that would
we can't possibly do that. Yeah,
that would be ridiculous. We better ship them over here, put them in housing and pay for their trips and then ship them all back. That's the much more reasonable way to handle this issue. And it's like, no, how about the $30 an hour? How about some labor rights? And to the extent that would disrupt, the economy or the price of goods, we have a president who started a trade war with literally every country in the world. You hear about China and Mexico, but in the front page of the Yakima Herald the other day was India. Millions of apples not being sold to India because apparently that's also a trade war front. And they quietly just sort of announced, well, we're going to be giving the farmers $15 billion.
Right.
And nobody gave a shit. Like that was.
And I would just say that, like, I'm not really, like, economics is not really my thing, but it just seems to me it's not that complicated. Like, yes, if the wages of these jobs need to, like, go up, and so that's going to increase the price of food, then, well, first of all, like, everyone who works deserves a living wage. So, like, $30 or not, like, I don't give a shit. Like, if that's what it costs, that's what it costs. And if that means that, like, we're going to need more redistributive policies because, the price of food is going to go up and most people in this country, like, can't afford that price increase, then, like, these are levers with which we would jigger things all the time. Like when we pay $15 billion to farmers for, accidentally fucking in the ass with those apples or whatever the fuck.
It's literally because the president doesn't know what trade is.
We're all the time.
It just shows
needs to give us a better deal just now.
Yeah.
Always.
People think that racism is N-word, and sometimes it is, but usually it's demonstrated in, like, our lack of imagination. The idea that, like, it would never even occur to us that what if we federally subsidized the wages of brown people so that they could make a living wage, or so that the jobs could be more competitive? What if we did that? It's not even
something to talk about, let alone, like, begin to examine and make implications of, because, like, there are always gonna be, like, knockoff effects of this shit. So I think, like, obviously, like, the experts would want to, like, look at this, and, like, you're a lawyer and I'm a podcaster and I'm a unemployed IT guy who podcasts, like, so this is not really a bailiwick that we're designed to, like, design a system top to bottom, but you can see broadly speaking how it would work.
It's a system that says, oh, we screwed up. Let's give the white landowners $15 billion, and no one's going to care or to notice or to say, wait, what? It's just money that is automatically there. So you're right. You and I aren't economists, and we don't know, this or that, or you put money here, it's going to do this or the other thing. But if the system is that flexible, that because the president is literally a dumb guy, there's $15 billion to go around, I think there's probably a way for these employers to apply for wage assistance, or to give the money directly to the employees, or to subsidize the food on the back end.
And it's always important to remember that the status quo is like it's going to be really tough, I think, to do worse than what we have in a lot of ways. Trying something a la FDR, bold, persistent experimentation in order to solve these problems is absolutely I think that's good, because doing nothing, not an option. But we're getting bogged down a bit. I wanna go forward to your favorite law. I know you're a big fan of this one,
right?
Because you gave me some commentary on it that I'll never forget. It, quote, really fucked a lot of people, and it really did. This is the last time we really took a crack at an immigration reform that passed in this country, through law, and that's often referred to as the IRA, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of '96. This is a GOP bill that Clinton's administration nonetheless signed without reservation and under much enthusiasm. So this act, it does a lot of really shitty things. Not a comprehensive list, but just a few things for you listener to know. Under this act, the range of crimes for which a legal immigrant can be deported is going to be drastically increased, and this change is going to be retroactive. So if you committed this crime in the past, you could be deported now. And under this system, these offenders that I'm talking about who are going to be deported, they're not going before a judge to plead their case or anything like that. They're just fast-tracked into removal proceedings. Also, this is when our 100-mile of the national border rule gets a big debut. That means that if Border Patrol picks you up anywhere within 100 miles of the national border of the United States, which, for the record, is where the majority of the people who live in the United States live, you also can't go in front of a judge to plead your case. Prior to this, immigrants, if you've been living undocumented in the United States for 7 years, but you could prove that deporting you would cause extreme hardship, you could get legal status. Now, these cases, obviously, you're not going to win every one that you could or want to win, but extreme hardship, that's the legal standard. And so that's tough to prove, but provable. But no more after this law. So, first of all, you got to be living in the United States for 10 years now to get your chance to prove this case after this law. And second, now you can't just prove that you're going to face extreme hardship from deportation. You have to show that some U.S. citizen, like maybe your spouse or child, would suffer, quote, exceptional and extremely unusual hardship, end quote. Which is obviously that means something a little different legally. And I think the law might just say this, but it's basically just understood. No, just being separated from your family, that sounds terrible to me. That's not a hardship enough. And also, finally, even if you can prove all of this, there's a maximum of 3,000 grants of relief per year for this category. So
right.
You can see how they've created this extremely complicated and specific Kafkaesque bureaucracy for
this type of
almost impossible to win.
Right. This type of a case it's a defensive case, which means if you get put in removal proceedings, you can present this sort of relief before an immigration judge to argue that you get to stay here. Now, this happened to me just the other day, where we presented all the hardship. And again, you used to be able to consider the hardship to the alien. Not anymore. It's only to their spouse, parent, or child with legal status, residency, or citizenship.
Yeah, I did say citizen, but I could also be a legal resident. Yeah.
Right. So in this case, the petition, the respondent, the alien, the client, whatever, and his family would be returning to Mexico. He has no family in Mexico. He did testify that he had his mother's cousin, who he contacted, and his mother's cousin was like, "Look, dude, We got like 4 people already in a 1-bedroom apartment. You can stay here for like a minute, but you got to be on your way. There's no work here, so good luck with that. And everything is terrible. And there was a bunch of other hardship, and the judge said, well, this hardship is extreme, but it's not exceptionally unusual. And so he denied the case. Now it's on appeal, and I think we might have luck there. But yeah, it's an extremely high standard, and they raised it on purpose to make it harder for people who've been here a long time, who have ties to the community, to make it harder for them to stay in the country.
So another thing that this law changed, very obviously for the worse. Before this law, let's say you're an undocumented immigrant living in the United States, and you fall in love, and you marry a United States citizen. Generally speaking, you're good to go before this law took effect. Not universally, but like that's usually enough for you to get a green card. After this law takes effect, that's not going to be the case. Because if you've been living in the United States without papers for 6 months or less, even if you marry a United States citizen, you have to leave the country for a minimum of 3 years. If you've been living in the United States for more than 6 months without papers, you have to leave for 10 years. And this is just so that you can apply to stay. You have to leave first if you're undocumented. Now, again, like we said, if you could prove extreme hardship, you can not be deported or not have to leave. But it's the same standard that we outlined before, and it's very, very tough to meet. And also, before you can even do that, you still have to leave the country. Now, if you win, you can come back, but if you lose, you can't, which makes this a very risky option, right? Just without this part of the law, about 5.3 million people who live here undocumented in the United States would be eligible for legal status. That's about half of all the undocumented immigrants living in the United States. So just this part of the law, these 3 and 10-year bars, accounts for half of the people who live in this country without papers. If it didn't exist, they could probably would all qualify for legal residency.
Yeah, it's immigration is complicated, and what are we going to do? And there's all these different interests and people you have to placate. But honestly, if you just went back to the 1996 laws, which were not great as we've outlined.
Exactly, yeah.
If you just repealed the 1996 immigration reform, millions of people would qualify. And it's not just that people are disqualified. It's that they're disqualified for the most ridiculous reasons. So I must have turned away thousands of cases of people who have been waiting for a visa petition, or they have a qualifying relative, a spouse maybe who's a U.S. citizen who wants to file a petition for them. But they've been here. They were here for more than a year without papers. They went back to Mexico for a funeral or to visit a sick relative, and they re-entered without papers, and now they're subject to a 10-year bar. There's no way around it.
There's nothing you can do.
There's no waiver. And people oftentimes will sit in my office very dumbfounded, like, yeah, but I'm like the exemplary immigrant. Like I pay my taxes. I go to PTA meetings. Like what else can I do? And it's like, no, there's nothing. And it's not that you're a terrorist. It's not that we are worried about you committing crimes. It's that you took a 3-day trip to Mexico in 2005, which is now like almost 15 years ago, or whenever it was, and then you came back without papers. And so the only way around that bar is to go back to your country, wait the 10 years out, and then reapply. And it's absurd. So
it's like you said before, what is it really about? They don't want these people here, like literally physically present in the country. That's why they put this in, and it's why it's still the case, because it makes them leave, or it's supposed to, and like that's what they want, straight up.
Right. Right. And the irony is that what this law has actually done is
made people hunker down, right?
Yeah, trapped a lot of people here. First of all, most people don't know about that law. And so people come into my office fully expecting to be able to apply for something, having married a U.S. citizen or whatever, and being totally unaware of the fact that, oh, well, that time you went back to Mexico in 2008, that completely disqualifies you. And there's nothing you can do but remain undocumented. So people are unaware of it. But the people who are aware of it, whereas in the past, you might have had seasonal workers who, came up, worked a season, went back, maybe spent a few years here, went back. But when you militarize the border, first of all, making crossing extremely dangerous or impossible, and then you combine it with legal penalties for coming and going, people get to a point where they have to say, all right, well, it's one or the other. And if you're here and you've got family or kids, or just given the geopolitical realities right now, people are going to choose to stay here. And so, yeah, it's the law has been a disaster.
So I kind of want to end with this, and it's because it's something you said when we were talking before this that I really liked. So let's imagine together. There's like a dude, and he's like 25 years older than us. He is a Republican and a conservative, but he's also like mostly just like a regular dude who's like apolitical mostly and doesn't like watch a ton of Fox or cable news or whatever. And if you go to a guy like that or a woman like that, they'll say something maybe like, well, yeah, like, but these people broke the law, and so they should have to get in line and apply like everyone else, and just follow the rules. And what's unspoken about that is that like the rules are clearly defined and clearly communicated, and also make sense in their own terms, and none of that's actually true.
And that they can be followed when a person wants to follow them. But
in any case, like, I think it's kind of an interesting idea to maybe just like sort of embrace that idea in some way and say, you know what, that's right. Let's have them get in line. Let's, via legislation, create a line for these people to get into that doesn't involve them having to leave the country for an arbitrary period of time because they went to go see their grandmother die 10 years ago, which is like a horrendous thing to contemplate, but like literally that shit happens. Like, no, let's just have them get in a line. They can pay a little fee or whatever, and like we can make them demonstrate that they're not leprous or like full of measles and mumps or whatever, or like sociopaths or like secret. Even if you want to like go through the perfunctory question where you still have to ask them if they're a communist or whatever, like fine, do all that shit. But you know what? Let's have a line that they can just like get in and then like get papers and then live and work here. That sounds good to me. That would be a good place to start.
This is something I've discovered in sort of talking to conservatives about this issue, is that the system that exists in their mind is actually
it's not that bad. Yeah,
it's not that bad, and that's not always the case. I mean, there's like the Tucker Carlson ideal, which is whatever,
or Stephen Miller. Like, yes,
right. But when you really sit down and talk to conservatives in person and you try and figure out what they're thinking, you find that like they have a sense that there's this equitable system that exists in reality, where people can go and apply and prove themselves worthy and then get papers, and
that just doesn't exist. Yeah,
it just doesn't exist. So my idea, this is for the Democrats out there, if you've made it an hour and a half into this podcast, we should have the 2019 Get in Line Act, And it's all about how it's finally time for immigrants to get in line and do it the right way. Now, meanwhile, what this act does is it actually creates the mechanism to do that. Now, of course, this wouldn't work.
I don't know, man. No, conservatives like love lines. And they fucking love hierarchy. They love that shit, man. I don't know.
Right. I mean, maybe you sneak this by, but that's how you would do it. So you know what? It's high time these people get in line, and we're gonna create the line for them to do that with. You sort of downplay that second part, but and really, I think most Americans, other than the straight up, white ethno nationalist, whatever people, have a sense of that when they come in with their Mexican, I mean, you don't understand. Like, his kids are great, and he's a hard worker, and he's a nice guy. Like, there's got to be a way for him to just sort of like earn it. And it's like,
this is not like that. This is not like that strong a point, but like, it doesn't get said hardly at all. You know what? If a guy messes up, loses his temper, gets in a fight, right, or maybe like gets drunk, crashes his car. Is like exile from the only nation that they've ever known, is that really an appropriate punishment for that crime?
Oh yeah, that's
you know what I
mean? That's a really important point, because I'm glad that you brought that up, because anytime immigration reform does roll around, and if we're lucky and the ball bounces our way a couple times, we could have the stars align for immigration reform at some point in the not too distant future, maybe. But there's always pressure to make it as restrictive as possible, even with like DACA, a single DUI or I think
just
multiple.
One slip up and you're just done.
Yeah, can totally disqualify you. And I actually got a denial on a case today for I'm sort of like in my head about it right now, but for some stuff that went down 20 years ago in this lady's case. And it's like, okay. So we do need to be beating that drum as much as we can, because immigration reform will come around, and there will be voices saying, all right, well, if you've ever had a misdemeanor, then you're totally disqualified for life, and you must be deported within 30 days. And we need to be the ones to say, well, look, everybody has the ability to learn from their mistakes, and they should be given the chance to learn from their mistakes and improve as people. And we need to make sure, deportation is not technically a punishment, but it is in substance, not in form, but in substance. And it's not just punishment, it's maybe the most punishing.
I mean, it's literally like feudal to me, or even like pre-feudal. Like the fucking Romans would exile you if you were that bad, and that was literally, that was a terrible thing to have happen, to like have to leave the only country or place that you've ever known because of like what, you get drunk and punched a guy, or like even if you do something like really bad, I'm not saying they shouldn't pay some sort of penalty legally speaking, but literally this is just like exile to me.
Right. And every one thing that's been interesting about this job is every case is different, and you do find people who like, oh wow, you just have a drinking and driving problem, and there's no root cause. You just really like drinking, and
right.
But when you really sit down and you get to meet somebody and you find out, this guy, maybe he had a domestic dispute with his wife a few years ago, and things got a little physical, and there was maybe pushing or shoving or words exchanged or whatever. It's very easy to say, how could this person have done this thing? That's horrible. And then when you sit down and you meet with them and you talk to them and you find out that might have been the home that they were raised in. And again, it's not an excuse, but sheds light on the context in which a lot of these things arise. They might have been abused themselves. Oftentimes, immigrants from Mexico and Central America had to drop out of school at very early ages and go to work, and they were exposed to adult situations, by the time they're 8 or 9 or 10 years old. And so, we just need to have more compassion and understanding and develop a system, not just within immigration, but the criminal justice system that is focused on rehabilitation and taking somebody, learning about who they are and then helping them improve
I do agree, but I also think we need a little like yin to your yang. We need a little less compassion in some ways, in that like we all need to recognize that there are tons of United States citizens, white, upstanding, property owning, who beat their wives, drink and drive, do a lot of drugs, cheat people at the car dealership they own, like fucking sell people the shiny ass undercoating, right? Every time. Like, there are tons of dumbass white people who lie, cheat, steal from their jobs, who fuck up, do dumb shit, who get drunk or coked out and drive a school bus into a fucking hospital or anything, right?
Right.
You know what we say about those people? Exactly the kinds of shit that you just said to me. Well, how did they grow up? How did they come to this? Are they literally crazy? In some cases, that answer's yes. And in that case, like, all joking aside, hey, they're crazy, but can't fucking help it, right? There could be a million different reasons. But one thing we don't do with those people is we don't exile them from this country forever. Hello.
Oh, hey.
Hi.
Breaking news. Do you want to share?
Yeah.
What did you do?
I heard toilet-related news.
Yeah, she did poopies in the toilet, so that's really great.
I'm so proud of you. Good job. That is where the poop goes.